Our webinar today is Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. Today we have Emmanuel Machado and Michelle Molnar. We will also have an introduction done by Dan Straker. Okay, so I will pass you off now to Dan Straker for the introduction.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Megan. So my name is Dan Straker. I'm a grad student at Simon Fraser University, working with Dr. Sean Markey, and I'm working particularly to apply the natural asset accounting concept with a rural lens. And that's what a lot of Sean Markey's work is, around rural work and local economic development. So a bit about the Rural Policy Learning Commons, which is who is hosting us today with Megan out in Brandon, Manitoba. So the Rural Policy Learning Commons is a 7-year partnership grant funded by SSHRC with the Rural Development Institute in Brandon University. The goal is to build rural capacity and strengthen relationships between institutions and practitioners who are working to facilitate, share, and develop better policy for rural places through information sharing. Most of the partners are in North America, but it also has an international lens with partners in Europe and Central America. So they're doing lots of different kinds of topics. There's governance, migration, renewable energy, resource development, and indigenous issues. 3 years in, they're 3 years in of their 7 years, and a lot of the work is being done through webinars like this, but there's also podcasts, conferences, papers, and policy briefs, and much more, social media, that kind of thing. And I have a distribution list of over 2,400 folks. And if you want to join, I imagine they can get in touch with you, right, Megan? Yes. Perfect, yeah. So now I'm going to do a little intro for Michelle and Manny, it's my pleasure to introduce these folks who have been doing such amazing work on this Natural Capital and Natural Assets Initiative. So they've done 52 presentations last year, I just heard. So they are veterans of the webinar circuit and conference circuit. So I'll start quickly with Emmanuel Machado, aka Manny. He is currently Chief Administrative Officer for the Town of Gibsons, BC on the Sunshine Coast. He has spent over 10 years working in a lot of rural communities across Canada and has gained a real reputation for innovating in local government. Michelle Molnar is an environmental economist and policy analyst working with the David Suzuki Foundation based in Vancouver, and has done some really amazing natural capital work, particularly around the south coast of BC. And with that, I will hand it over to Michelle to get us started. Thanks, you guys.
All right. Well, thank you, Megan and Dan, for the invitation today to speak to everyone. The Municipal Natural Assets Initiative is a collaboration of 4 primary groups, including the Town of Gibsons, which Emmanuel is representing today, the David Suzuki Foundation, which I'm representing, but also Smart Prosperity, which is a think tank out of the University of Ottawa, and Brook and Associates. So the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative is an emerging initiative to manage natural assets such as forests, wetlands, creeks, as part of a sustainable infrastructure strategy. Essentially, we're working with local governments to identify, value, and account for the contribution of natural assets to municipal service delivery. Okay. So the core idea in one sentence is that natural assets can provide services to municipalities that they would otherwise need to deliver through an engineered asset. So for example, a wetland stores water. That wetland can reduce peak water flows and flooding, just as an engineered culvert or retention pond might. Unfortunately, almost no municipal government is currently considering the role of natural assets for 3 core reasons, or really there's 3 core reasons that they should. The first problem is that infrastructure is in poor shape, particularly here in Canada. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities in 2016 found that 1/3 of our infrastructure is in either fair poor or very poor condition. And of course, that situation increases the risk of service disruption. The second problem is that our ecosystem health is declining. Overall, our natural capital is not measured, managed, or valued in the same way as human or financial capital. This often leads to the loss of our natural environments, and along with that, the vital services that they provide. Unfortunately, we're learning more and more that ignoring nature can bring about undocumented risks and real quantifiable costs to communities. Lastly, there's a growing and well-documented urgency to address infrastructure issues as a result of global population growth, urbanization trends, and climate change impacts, including sea level rise, drought, and more frequent and intense storms. So at the end of the day, local governments really need new ways to deliver services. What's new is there's been a major change over the last few years and how we can look at the natural asset landscape. Now municipalities are required increasingly to focus on assets from a life cycle perspective. So for example, here in Canada, the 2009 Public Sector Accounting Board Standard 3150 includes a provision for municipal tangible capital assets to be identified, counted, valued, and amortized over their useful lifetime. This standard really highlights the need for a proactive management and assessment of our assets. So this, together with things like riders on gas tax funding, in some cases legislative change, is forcing local governments to take on modern structured asset management. And really the key point here is the core of this modern asset management is the idea of sustainable service delivery, meaning that delivering service rather than focusing on the underlying asset is the business of government. So this means it does not matter if, say, stormwater is managed by culverts or wetlands or both. What matters is the service is delivered reliably and cost effectively. So this situation favors natural assets because they often have no capital costs, lower operating costs, and at the end of, let's say, 50 well-managed years, they can be more valuable than their comparable engineered alternatives. So I'm just going to touch upon the town of Gibsons where this all got started. As Dan mentioned, the town is on the Sunshine Coast, and they were the first local government to really catch on to this in an integrated way. They went through their standard asset management process of inventorying assets, doing condition assessments, risk analysis, operating plans, and all those pieces related to asset management. At the end of the process, however, they realized that this was great, but this didn't account for some key assets, ones that conveyed stormwater like forest, an aquifer that provide drinking water, or a healthy foreshore that really protects their core downtown area from storm surges and sea level rise. So this led to a flurry of activity, really, that started with North America's first asset management plan that puts natural and engineered assets on the same footing and has cascaded through a number of other developments like subdivision development charge bylaws, operations and maintenance plans, and I'm sure Emmanuel will fill you in on some of this. But at the end of the day, there was the clear realization that nature is a valuable asset and it can save money. So having completed this work with the town of Gibsons, a few of us thought, okay, this is great. Can or should it be scaled up though? You know, what's the next step? So In November of 2015, we gathered a group of municipal, financial, and asset management stakeholders in Vancouver to determine really whether this is something that we can transfer or apply to other local governments. The answer we received back was a resounding yes. Not only could it be scaled, but really it should be scaled. So this led in April of 2016 to the launch of 5 pilots. They included 3 in British Columbia and 2 in Ontario, the city of Nanaimo, the district of West Vancouver, and the city of Grand Forks in BC, and then the town of Oakville in the region of Peel in Ontario. I am going to touch upon what we found with those pilots, but first I'm going to turn it over to Emmanuel to discuss the Gibsons experience, and then I'll come back and discuss that. So over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Michelle. So nature and the ecosystem services that it provides is a fundamental component of a municipal infrastructure system and also of its climate resiliency. In Gibsons, many of the key services we deliver to our citizens, including climate mitigation and adaptation, are directly or indirectly delivered by nature. Our Gibsons aquifer stores and filters our drinking water. Our forested areas, our creeks, natural ponds, and our soils combined treat the vast majority of the stormwater in our town. And the foreshore, which is still vastly in a natural state, except for the sort of the inner harbor, is been providing us protection from sea level rise and storms as well. And we continue to invest in these assets to make sure that we continue to benefit from these services. To adequately manage these assets, however, we didn't have sort of a ready-to-use framework, but ventured down that path anyway. And what we found is that there's a practice, a sort of revised practice for local government that integrates nature considerations into decision-making, into planning, and operational decisions as well. And that practice includes elements of asset management, of financial planning, and of ecology. Starting with asset management has really been the best fit. Just about everything we know about maintaining infrastructure, typically engineered infrastructure, can almost straightforwardly apply to natural assets as well. Moreover, we have it's our core business, and we have trained staff that are generally well equipped to tackle these challenges as well. I think one of the biggest changes within that is that we've moved from operating individual assets to managing natural systems with some engineered components within those systems. And the system thinking is it's a must-have in our view, because otherwise I think we miss a lot of the opportunities. The other strong influence is financial planning and recording. The fit wasn't as straightforward. We lack metrics and standards that fully recognize ecosystem services and the associated value that comes with it. And our entry point into that financial planning considerations was actually thinking through risks and liabilities, to try to understand in terms of our dependency on nature, what is our exposure to that and what is our plan to deal with those matters. Sort of a new front from a financial planning and reporting aspect of it is doing the actual valuations to understand what is the value of the services that we get from nature. And that's where we met Michelle, and we've learned a lot from that whole field of work, and it's been very wonderful. On a more straightforward basis, funding, be it capital operational issues, it's relatively straightforward, and it's mostly, there's no impediments to that aside from council, or the community having that wish, as opposed to the recording side of finance, where there's the rules to contend with. So The area that we probably have the least experience, however, is on the ecology side, and but nevertheless, it's well beyond our standard practice of maintaining green space, and we're learning as we go, particularly understanding condition assessments and the management adjustments that we have to do as well and have made to fully reflect sort of using an integrated team approach to manage these assets, because they're a lot more complex than before. At the end of the day, from an ecological perspective, we're trying to understand what is the ecological integrity of the asset to restore where if necessary, and at the same time not over service the asset itself. So trying to find the right balance between ecological integrity and service delivery. Next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. Municipal natural asset management, as in our view, is we're trying to demonstrate that it serves to integrate nature into climate initiatives as well, aside from the strictly asset management focus of the work. However, what big early finding is that we have a scale issue where town boundaries per se, or communities boundaries, aren't necessarily neatly aligned with a watershed boundary. And I think for us to be truly sustainable, we have to have a planning scale at a watershed scale. And so it's with that view in mind that we have been undertaking reviews of nearly all of our policies, and started with the official community plan, where council, in essence, the community now changed the definition of infrastructure to include this inheritance of natural capital that we've been blessed with, and which was completely missing from our books and our plans as well. Also, we subsequently changed our subdivision standards, in essence, what we ask the developers to build in terms of the future, the growth of our community, is to better align what we're asking for and our ability to maintain it. And increasingly, we're asking for less infrastructure, and we want that infrastructure to be as natural as possible. And so we've had very good support from the development community as well, because we're finding ways to preserve more natural capital that we have and restore some, and they're also making financial contributions towards that, and I'll explain that in just a second. Still within the planning framework and policy area, this asset management or natural asset management planning complements very well with our other initiatives around climate change mitigation and adaptation in particular, where we primarily were focused on sort of GHG accounting, and now appreciate that to be truly sustainable, we have to balance as well and have solid carbon sinking spaces, and which also serve well for our recovery from severe storms and other issues. So ultimately, a healthy ecosystem and a healthy watershed is what's necessary for our ultimate sustainability. Nature itself is very cost effective. A natural asset has substantial advantages over an engineered asset. It has no upfront costs, no replacement costs, and no financial depreciation costs either. It's carbon neutral. It can even be carbon positive, and that's very important for everyone, and particularly for us in BC that have clear goals to be carbon neutral in our operations as well. It could last in perpetuity, which is not something we can say about every asset that we have, and if maintained properly, it should stay in our community for many years, and as Michelle pointed out, actually increase in value rather than decrease. And another benefit of natural assets is they tend to be multi-purpose, like our parks, which do stormwater conveyance, but also is where people gather and recreate and connect with nature as well. Next slide, please, Michelle. Nature is also more resilient, and I think the question is, can we afford actually not to maintain these natural assets? With the changing climate, we're seeing more severe storms and more frequent severe weather, I should say. What we note about just within our class of stormwater assets, for example, our older assets struggle. Our piping that was installed in the 50s and 60s don't have the resiliency that our natural assets have. Our creeks and our foreshore areas and our ponds, you know, a day or two after a major storm look like they did before, for the most part. And also with longer periods of droughts, we rely on the Gibsons aquifer to store and treat our drinking water. And so we have instituted a pretty comprehensive monitoring program, and it's been a few years now into this, because we want to have a little bit more comfort with that reliance on nature for the provision of a service. There's also, within sort of risk analysis, the understanding the legal implications of an asset failure, be it from business interruption or from a property damage or even loss of life. And also from a financial risk analysis, thinking about if we're relying on these assets for service, do we have the money set aside to replace these assets in case of failure in that case? The Insurance Bureau of Canada is on record as well as recommending strong investments in green infrastructure to protect Canada from the future climate change impacts. And the upcoming federal infrastructure funds have dedicated amounts for green infrastructure investments as well. Our experience shows that it certainly pays to invest in nature. Our goal is to have assets that are the most natural, the most energy efficient, the most reliable, and that cost the least to operate over the long term. And in order to have that goal, we have to manage our natural assets alongside our engineered assets as well. Next slide, please. So Gibsons, it's been sort of the living lab for the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. And we've been developing this practice in terms of policy and guides and just really testing out our theories in a real life site in this case. It's been a wonderful experience to benefit from our partners and jointly defining this emerging sector, this natural asset management. And the pilots, which Michelle is going to give us a few more details on, that are coming out. There's very good policy verification, tools, resources, and so we feel confident about the ability to support communities going forward and replicating and progressing from what we've done as well. Our motto at the Town of Gibsons is to find practical solutions for impossible situations. And so our eco-asset strategy is sort of an example of that. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to Michelle.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. So just before addressing each of the pilots, I thought I'd give, a very high level overview of how we actually look at incorporating natural assets into asset management. So I have here on the slide a image from Asset Management BC, but it's a fairly standard process asset management. Using ecological economic modeling, we help communities really work through the first couple phases of asset management, specifically the assess and the planning phase, and hopefully set them up to implement asset management through their operations and finances. So in the assessment stage, we work with them to answer questions like, what is your natural asset inventory? Just as municipalities are now developing, a clear inventory of their engineered assets, we're suggesting that that's complemented with natural assets. We then ask, what is the asset condition? How well is it providing the targeted service, and can it be improved? We also look at what is the value of that natural asset. And how we approach that is, once we understand the capacity of a natural asset to provide a certain service, we then ask, if that asset were degraded or lost, what would it cost the town to replace that with engineered assets? From there, we move into the planning stage and start looking ahead. We start thinking about what is the unique situation of this community? What changes are they anticipating to either land use, perhaps they're undergoing land use intensification, perhaps environmental management, or what many are looking at is the climate change projections for their community. So we do scenario analysis with them to help them understand how the ability of that asset is going to change over time. That all leads up to developing an operations and maintenance plan, which ideally will get included in an annual budget so that we're able to maintain the capacity of that asset to provide that service over time. So with that, I'll just touch briefly upon each of the pilots that we've been working with over the past year and a half. I have to say that they were all incredibly active and engaged participants, and were among really our strongest partners. So we'll start with the city of Nanaimo, which is on Vancouver Island here in BC. For the city of Nanaimo, a key objective related to maximizing the municipal services from the Buttertubs Marsh Conservation Area. That's a reclaimed wetland in the center of their city. So that pilot study demonstrated that in addition to all the recreational biodiversity benefits that this marsh provides, it also provides stormwater detention benefits that are really commensurate with engineered infrastructure. The modeling indicated, in addition, really the resilience of this marsh to climate change conditions, providing a similar level of service despite higher projected volume and velocity of flows. So we estimated the value of that marsh, currently at $4 to $4.5 million. So that's how much it would cost to replace the detention benefits. When we looked ahead at the climate projections, however, to 2100, that value essentially doubled to $8 million. So the difference in value really emphasizes the increasing importance of natural assets in providing, those critical services to municipalities. The District of West Vancouver, moving on to them, was interested in naturalizing their community. They've recently completed an integrated stormwater management plan, and the option of daylighting was proposed for a handful of creeks. They asked us to create a simple model that estimates the biophysical and financial aspects of daylighting. So we started by looking at a tributary of Brothers Creek, which happened to be close to an elementary school. We worked with the district to develop a design for an open channel that conveyed the 1 in 200 year storm event. So that's where they were looking to upgrade their engineering to. We costed that design of that open channel against the option of upgrading their culvert to handle a 1 in 200 year storm event. So when we looked at those two options, starting with just the capital costs of either increasing the size of the culvert versus developing an open channel, the daylighting option was more expensive, as many of you could probably guess. Yet, we did some work with them to create a multiple criteria decision analysis where we started to consider the co-benefits of that open channel. So we started factoring in considerations such as educational values, such as the increases in the property values that are near that creek, the community and the economic vitalization that's going to happen. And we found that the options were quite comparable. As well, of course, going forward, when we look at the life, the projected life of a stream versus the culvert, then you start seeing the argument for daylighting becoming stronger and stronger. Moving to the region of Peel, they're a large region supporting a population of 1.2 million people in Ontario. They were really interested in the concept of integrating natural assets into its asset management framework, having worked with the idea of natural capital for quite a while there. They wanted to better understand the role of natural assets related to water purification, water supply, and protection from floods. So they really kind of expanded a bit what we were doing. We looked at two sub-watersheds, one that was more rural and one that was more urban. And within those watersheds, we looked at wetlands, we looked at forests, we looked at open spaces. We classified the wetlands into three different types. What we found was that all the natural assets provide attenuation of the 100-year peak flow. In addition, all features, with the exception of the riverine wetlands, the other wetlands were included, exceeded the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change enhanced water quality performance requirements. So what that means, practically speaking, is all of the features, with the exception of the riverine wetlands, were able to remove 80% of total suspended solids naturally on an average annual basis. So we then moved to the valuation stage. Using the replacement cost method that I had referred to before, we found the value of the services in those two small sub-watersheds to amount to $700 million. We also did climate change scenario analysis. They looked out to 2065, so not as far as Nanaimo. But again, we saw the value increase to just over $750 million. Again, highlighting the increasingly important role of natural assets in helping a community adapt to climate change. The town of Oakville was really concerned about older development areas south of the QEW, for those of you who know the area. We're changing land patterns, particularly in the form of larger homes, was affecting their water table and putting increased pressure on existing stormwater conveyance systems. So we looked at a remnant stream channel in the area and asked about the services that it is providing. We wondered if the ability to monetize some of those services could really create a basis for new municipal strategies to manage their natural assets. So we looked at this small remnant channel and just looked at the ability of it to convey stormwater and to attenuate some of the flooding. When we looked at comparing it to the cost of the gray infrastructure that would be required to perform the same services, we found it would cost $1.2 million to match the services. Now, the town of Oakville is undergoing intensification in the area, so this was really the scenario that they wanted us to model. So when we looked ahead to the medium term and understood how the land use is going to change, we again looked at the value of that remnant stream, and it increased in value to $1.44 million. So again, the increasing value of these natural assets. Lastly, the city of Grand Forks was really interested in a floodplain. They actually have two floodplains, one that's more rural and one that's more urban along the Kettle River. Recognizing that development threatens the floodplain and recognizing its positive role in the management of water surrounding and within the town, along with the fact that they had a flooding event partway through the pilot and actually had a state of emergency, they asked us to help them to begin to quantify the flood mitigation benefits of that floodplain. And we started by specifically looking at a small downtown area. So we used, for this one, actually an avoided cost approach, slightly different, to determine what would the impacts of a flood be if they had built on that floodplain and essentially removed some of the values. For really a handful of buildings, I think we're talking about 30, the value of that floodplain was $2,000 per hectare. And they're now moving to look at, a much larger regional study. So those are our initial results. I do want to recognize, before I get into, what the next steps for the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative is, who some of our partners has been up to this point in this work. So I already addressed who the convening partners are. The donors include the Real Estate Foundation, the Greenbelt Foundation, the Sitka Foundation, Tides Canada, the Salamander Foundation, and Van City. We've also had some great technical partners through this work, including the Partnership for Water Sustainability in BC, Asset Management BC, and the Natural Capital Lab. So I'm just going to close with where we're at now and what some of the next steps for us are. We have a second cohort of pilots. We currently, 2 of them are in BC, including the municipality of Courtenay, Sparwood, BC. In Ontario, we're working with the town or city of Oshawa. And in New Brunswick, we're working with 2 regional districts, the Southeast Regional Service Commission and the Western Regional Service Commission. We're also expanding our methodology beyond stormwater. So it made sense to start with stormwater, but through the whole process, we've really wanted to build out the methodology. So starting this year, we're going to be working on looking at coastal natural capital in response to sea level rise and storm surges. So specifically, I'm working again with a multidisciplinary team to look at how salt marsh assets provide protection from coastal flooding. We also are starting to do work on a watershed scale. I think that we've been wanting to do this for a while, recognizing that really the watershed is the right level at which to do this work. So here in BC, we're going to be working ideally with a group of communities around one watershed to really help them understand this approach and help them, really get geared up for launching into it themselves, so that, they don't have to walk with us through a longer pilot process. But for those that, that should hopefully allow them to kind of hit the ground running on their own, with the understanding that they're all working together at a watershed level. The groups are also looking at what's involved with becoming a national nonprofit organization to really mainstream this approach. We'd like to see this incorporated into asset management across the country. So in order to really do that and to tool ourselves up, we're considering this as an option. Along this whole process in the background, we've been really looking at work and research on enabling conditions to support municipal asset management. And this is being led by Smart Prosperity. So they've been asking things like, from a policy and regulation perspective, what is required to mainstream this. They recently completed a report with planners in Ontario to get an idea of, where are the opportunities and barriers there, and there's much more work planned to help really develop and impact sector. The last question is, can we include a greater rural emphasis? I think, a key consideration is it's often those more natural or rural areas often that provide a significant level of services for those more urban developed communities that they lie in and around. So if there's a way to recognize that and start to think about how we integrate that into our planning, then another area that we would be quite interested in exploring further. Lastly, you can follow us for more information, and we do have now a new website. So while there's a Facebook address there, you can also access our website. It's MNAI.ca, which contains all of our latest research and reports, and very soon case studies and the results from those will be presented. And I've also included an email address. We do send out updates on the process, and you can certainly follow us and our work that way as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Megan, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so that concludes our presentation part, and I want to say thank you for your very informative presentations. We are now moving into our Q&A period. Okay, so we do have a question from Ashley Webster, and she wants to know if reports are reports available for these pilot projects?
We're in the midst of writing up the case studies now, so we're getting close. We do have the original Gibsons report available on our website. So you can access that first one at mnai.ca, and I'm hoping that within a month or so, we'll have the other 5.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Donna Gold. He asks, what can we do as a community member to encourage our council to think green?
Well, maybe I can address that. Our inspiration to do this work came from the community. Back in 2013, we released a mapping study of the aquifer, and about 100 and so people came out to a tiny room, and we had a distinct feeling there was an expectation that we should be having more detailed plans on how to deal with these natural areas that people valued so much. I think perhaps most people are aware of a particular natural asset within their communities, and they might have an association with that, not necessarily related to a service that the city would be concerned with. But even just starting by identifying those areas and making the council and staff in particular sort of aware of those areas, and just start to raise questions and point out where these resources are now available. Our feeling is that within a matter of a few years, will be the majority of communities would be at least identifying their natural assets and progressing in terms of the management of that as well.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Mike Dickinson. Have you considered forest fires in your natural asset management?
It's certainly, is included there in the group of extreme events that we're hoping to address. We started with the next step by sending out a survey to many of the municipalities that were on our mailing list, kind of providing a bit of an overview of where we could move to next. it was fairly good list. And while we found that there was kind of broad interest across the range of where we would expand to next, sea level rise came out slightly above the others. So that's why we've started with that as a next step. But I think we do. Ideally, our vision is to see, quite a wide range of services for various natural assets that we can model with some degree of rigor and provide quantitative monetary results that are defensible.
Thank you. And I'm wondering about how the co-benefits of natural assets are recognized.
Yeah, so interestingly, we did work on that with a number of the pilots. We originally thought that the municipalities would only be interested in those services that fell clearly under their mandate, but that's not the case. I think that their communities are telling them that the range of co-benefits of services are actually quite wider. So we did what we called beneficiary considerations for each of the services, and that was to help us understand. So the work we were doing with all the modeling gave us a good understanding of the supply side. How well is that asset providing the identified service? But then we looked at the demand side through this beneficiary analysis, where we asked what services are being demanded from this asset. And they were wide. They range from biodiversity habitat to educational values, health and well-being. We didn't, however, in many cases, the vast majority of cases, try to quantify those. Those are quite intangible assets, and I'm not sure if the quantification would be useful to the municipalities. So we did a range of indicators, either from what populations are really relying upon this, to some broad high level values for the District of West Vancouver. I think is the only one we really did it, so they could start to identify and prioritize candidate streams for daylighting, but just for that purpose, not necessarily to incorporate the values of, say, the educational value of a daylight stream into any practical decisions, other than simply identifying which stream to daylight.
Well, thank you. Okay, so our next question is from Heather Dalglish. Do any of the communities involved link development plans with watershed plans?
I think perhaps the closest work that we saw was in Peel, where they have the clear conservation authorities, where they have the mandate to really provide advice to the lower tier municipalities based upon watershed health. So they do a lot of work at the watershed scale and work to advise the municipalities which fall within that watershed. I can't speak to how closely they're linked, though. Emmanuel, I don't know if you can add to that.
Certainly. Ontario probably is one of the better positioned areas in Canada that has a structured organization and series of organizations managing watersheds, not necessarily aligned with cities, but part of our process is to help to make that connection for communities downstream that can benefit as well from those services. In BC, it's a lot more complex in that the watersheds are mostly sitting in Crown land for the most part, with a variety of other uses and users that aren't necessarily prioritizing drinking water for a community as a priority. So when you're doing land use planning, and it's one of our strong motivators to see better models of governance, which I think, aside from the strict speaking of planning scale, but at the end of the day, the governance is a big issue in BC in particular. And how do we, in Gibsons, we have 6 agencies from the top of the watershed to the ocean, and they all have different jurisdictions, policies, and priorities. And so our view with that is also working on, aside from strictly the assessment of the watershed, is important to have an accompanied governance model and management plan that all parties sort of adhere to those objectives. And we think there's benefits to all parties if we can restore the critical integrity of the watershed. But it's not just a one group of ministry that sort of makes that call. It's we're going to need to do a lot more work, and that could be said across Canada as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Our next question is from Sean Markey, and he wants to know if you could please speak to any provincial or federal policy processes you are engaged in, and if not, how can we best promote this at a policy level?
I can think of 2 or 3 perhaps. We've been directly engaged in one of our biggest supporters has been the province of BC through the Ministry of Community Services and Asset Management BC. We, through that, have been working to update requirements, planning requirements, and so on. In terms of funding, some of the provincial and federal funds now very clearly support identifying and restoring natural areas, which I think it's a huge amount of progress, I would say. And Michelle and others are involved as well in helping BC sort of update its climate policy beyond just GHG emissions, and we are working to see more natural capital considerations within those policy areas as well. Those are within the, I think there's opportunities within resource extraction, energy and mines, forestry. I think those are sort of fraught with opportunities, but this has been our effort so far: funding, asset management, and climate policy.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So our next question is from Mike Dickinson. Do you have a target percentage tree cover in your urban areas that you are managing for now, or a plan for increasing it over time?
We don't have a target. We're starting, the areas where we really considered forests was with the Town of Gibsons and Peel. In both of those cases, we weren't looking at street trees, but urban forests or more rural forests. So we looked at the forests as they currently were and what kind of capacity they were providing for conveying stormwater and filtering the water.
I can add a little bit to that. A few years back, we conducted an urban forest plan for the town of Sechelt, which is down the highway from us here. It was interesting, just for context, some of the more dense forested areas were close to 80% coverage, while the downtown core was around sort of the mid-30s. Viewed from the air, it still looks pretty dense, sort of in their 30s. I think I've been thinking more lately that it's not so much about just having density in the forest, is having the right trees in the right place. And I think those places is if we just look at sort of the original, the ecosystem services that are in those areas, be it the creeks or rivers or wetlands, and starting there, perhaps are more important than just vegetating a field, for example, that isn't necessarily associated with a service. So from the perspective of cities and local governments, we want to make sure we have the right tree in the right place.
Great, thanks. So our next question is from Mike as well. Were any of the pilot projects tied to planning or ongoing private development projects? If so, what was the feedback from the development community?
Emmanuel, I think that the town of Gibsons had the most clear development path, so maybe I'll turn that one over to you.
Yes. One of our earlier motivators to try to find a way to bridge the gap between sort of pro-development and pro-conservation folks that for the most part couldn't seem to get along. We try to structure our policy to sort of be in between those two opposing views. And what I mean is when we undertake this work, we change our subdivision standards so that we're working with developers to protect our natural areas, particularly the ones that were related to a service. And that was a good signal because it would also add an associated lower cost from a maintenance perspective and even an upfront cost for them. We follow that up with, in BC, we use development cost charges and storm assets. We just happen to have a lot of our stormwater assets that are natural assets themselves, and so we were able to apply that charge onto the actual protection of the service. So we now have the development community contributing towards protection of natural areas. Yes, they do benefit from the service, but we're trying to demonstrate that it's possible to preserve natural areas, in some cases restore them, and still allow for development to happen. I hope that answers that.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I think that's all of our questions. So I would just like to again say thank you to our presenters, Emmanuel and Michelle, for your great presentations, as well as a thanks to the audience for attending and for your questions.